Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris. I'm an AmeriCorps service member serving at Chagrin River Watershed Partners. And today we are bringing you a webinar episode as a part of our 2023 to 2024 speaker series. Dr. Svitana. My name is Chris. I'm an AmeriCorps service member. Hey, Dr. Svitana, I think I hear feedback on your end. Do you think you could possibly exit out of that? Sorry, everybody, technical difficulties. Give us a second, please. Dr. Svitana, my name is. Oh boy.
Am I still there?
Hey, Dr. Svitana. I can still hear you. Do you hear me in the background, Dr. Svitana?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to like figure out what's going on right now. Technical difficulties. Well, it's not on my end at the very least. Yeah, whatever. We can probably continue. All right.
Yes, I do, and I'm getting a repeat on this.
Yeah, I don't really know. I don't think whatever's happening is on my end at the very least. But yeah.
Let me see here.
It's fine. Continue. All right.
Yes, I do, and I'm getting a repeat on this.
Yeah. Oh boy. I don't really know. I don't think whatever's happening is on my end at the very least. But do you think you could temporarily mute yourself, Dr. Savannah, as I just start the introduction and then just hand it over to you? Is that okay?
I'm muted.
Okay, cool. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris. I am an AmeriCorps service member serving at Chagrin River Watershed Partners. And today, the CRWP is partnering with Dr. Svitana to bring you a webinar presentation as a part of our winter webinar series for the 2023 to 2024 season. This is our 5th webinar as a part of our series, where CRWP partners with environmental professionals to deliver educational presentations to other interested professionals and members of the public. We have been and will continue to promote this series through our e-newsletter, social media pages, and our website. If you're interested in learning more about this series, feel free to check out our website and sign up for more webinars that we have scheduled for the next 2 months. If you have questions, feel free to type any as we go in the chat box on your screen, and we can cover them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. Just to let you know, today's presentation is being recorded and will eventually be uploaded to our YouTube page. In my follow-up email, I will include a link to this recording so you can review it at any time. In addition, I will also include a survey that helps Chagrin River Watershed Partners prepare high-quality webinars for the public and environmental field at large. A PDF file of today's presentation should be available on the GoToWebinar portal and will be uploaded to our website in the coming days. For today's webinar, CRWP is partnering with Dr. Kevin Svitana, Professor of Biology and Earth Science at Otterbein University, to present on Brownfield Remediation and Restoration in the Midwest. His presentation will cover several case studies on how the remediation process works and general elements of environmental remediation and restoration. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Svitana. Thank you and welcome.
Okay, well, hopefully we solved technical difficulties. So yes, I'll just add a little bit to the introduction that Chris has already given me. Thank you, Chris. And I am a professor at Otterbein University, geologist by trade. I have over 40 years of experience primarily in remediation work at hazardous waste sites. I actually was a consultant for 20 years before I started teaching. So a lot of my consulting experience is related to exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So the topic today that the Chagrin River Watershed Partners wanted me to address was talking about brownfield restoration, and we like to refer to that as land recycling. And some of you may recognize the Cleveland skyline there in the background. I'm based in Columbus, Ohio, so a lot of when I start talking about particular sites will be related more to the central Ohio region. So with that, let me move forward. So what are brownfields? If we use the EPA Region 5 definition, those are recognized as abandoned, idled, or underused industrial commercial sites where expansion redevelopment is complicated by real or perceived, I want to emphasize perceived, environmental contamination that can add cost, time, or uncertainty to a redevelopment project. And often it's that uncertainty that limits the interest in these particular properties, and I'll get into that a little more. These are typically remnants of old factories, failed businesses, businesses that started and then were unable to become profitable, businesses that literally produced buggy whips or something of that nature that just became obsolete. So what has actually caused this abundance of brownfields? And throughout Ohio, I mean, there's no shortage of these type of properties. One of the things that happened at the turn of the 19th century was the evolution of the electrochemical industry. And this is where we really started making a lot of synthetic chemicals that were very popular, but they also became very persistent and very widespread throughout the environment. And the illustration of this, if you're familiar with Rachel Carson's book that she published in 1962, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson was an environmental scientist, and she was working with the other environmental scientists who kind of understood these synthetic chemicals and how they were becoming more prevalent and how they were affecting the overall environment. And fortunately, she was a writer who could write to the folks who weren't not, scientists, and that's one of the reasons why Silent Spring is recognized as a landmark publication. Silent Spring actually focused on one of the stories that caught the public attention. The bald eagle was identified as an endangered species in the 1960s, and the connection between DDT, the pesticide, and the endangerment of the bald eagles was explained in the book, and that's when the public started realizing we might have a problem. Then as the public became more aware, and of course, things were happening like in Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire for the several times, and that led to the Comprehensive Environmental Restoration, Compensation, and Liability Act, known as CERCLA, which was also known as Superfund. And this was a program that was intended to identify the federal government, the US EPA, which was formed in 1970, was to identify sites where the public and the environment were at risk from toxic chemicals, uncontrolled toxic chemicals, and the federal government would come in and start working on these sites. They would identify responsible parties, and then the responsible parties would have the option of either taking over the cleanup under the supervision of US EPA or just reimbursing US EPA for their efforts towards the cleanup of the site. And again, that program started in the 1980s, and with it, people started getting pulled, companies started getting pulled into these cleanup activities where they were tasked with needing to spend millions and millions of dollars in order to do the cleanup. And that created a lot of uncertainty, particularly with environmental laws and policies. And in a landmark case where the First Bank of Maryland was actually held responsible for a property that they foreclosed on and ended up taking over and being a responsible party, that even caused the lending industries to rethink lending money to potentially contaminated properties, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of due diligence done now anytime that properties are sold. So there is also just the public has a fear of pollution. People hear about things like lead and asbestos and PCBs, and there's an inherent fear of that. And initially, when Superfund was developed, there was no voluntary program that would allow the owners of these properties, or interested parties for that matter, to actually go through and do a cleanup. So I'm going to pick a site over in Pennsylvania. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and this is kind of an example of how we ended up with brownfields. So this is Bethlehem Steel, and if we go back into the 1950s, Bethlehem Steel was one of the major corporations in the U.S. And they had a manufacturing process where they not only did the mining to produce the ore, to produce the steel, but they also mined the coal and the limestone, and they also made the coke and other materials for the steel. So it was kind of an integrated type operation. And Johnstown was one of their many mills. And if you're familiar with Johnstown, Pennsylvania, it's a very hilly area. The floodplain in the city, and Johnstown had a couple of major floods through their history because of the geography and basically being a river valley. But this facility took up quite a bit of the footprint. Well, by the end of the 1980s, Bethlehem Steel had made their run. They no longer were competitive. They didn't put enough redevelopment into their facilities. So eventually, Bethlehem Steel disappeared. So now what Johnstown's faced with is this very large footprint that essentially doesn't generate tax revenue anymore. And that has hurt the Johnstown economy since the late 1980s into the 1990s. And we could talk about, Youngstown or Mansfield or any other city in Ohio, similar type of application. And to this day, I have a 2019 photo and a 1994 photo here, basically showing that footprint hasn't changed. There's no new occupants in there. So this is a problem because of the contamination associated with the manufacturing facility, and there's no entity to actually move forward with it. So how do you solve these problems? Well, they're complex. So you need multidisciplinary teams. You need chemists, toxicologists, geologists, soil scientists, biologists, economic specialists, engineers, planners, and regulatory specialists, because the regulatory framework for a lot of these is very complicated and multidisciplinary. I'll also step back to the planners too. One of the things you have to think about when you're going to attack a brownfield problem, you have to have a vision of what you want it to be at the end. Because if you don't know what you're working toward, then it's very difficult to figure out the appropriate regulatory framework and the risk mitigation. So when you're evaluating, so let's move forward now and start talking about, we have a brownfield site and we actually want to do something to try to redevelop it, something to put it back into a more viable use. So some of the things you need to know are the types of contaminants, and sometimes that's pretty easy to figure out. Sometimes a facility may have changed operations several times from, the early 1900s, coming up to the modern day to whenever it closed. And they may have had different operations with different chemicals and different products. And you have to literally do detective work to try to figure that out, particularly if the records are not very robust. The next thing you have to understand is, once you have an idea of the contaminants, which relates to their dose and toxicity, you need to figure out the mobility of those contaminants, the fate and the transport. That's basically how long will it persist in the environment and how far will it travel if it's traveling. So the next consideration is exposure pathways. Who or what could actually be exposed to the chemicals in the setting that they're in? And then looking forward, you're going to try to eliminate these pathways using engineering controls. And we'll look at some applications of that later on. But again, I want to emphasize, it's envisioning what a site can become. Because if you want it to be residential housing, the effort is going to be much larger than, say, a commercial or retail facility. So we're going to talk quickly here about toxins without going into a lot of detail, but there are a lot of things that we're exposed to that as long as the dose is fine, we're okay. You know, caffeine is a good example of that. Most people get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, go about their business, you know, that helps wake them up, etc. However, if you decide to have maybe 10 cups of coffee, that may start affecting your circulatory system. It may start affecting your heart rate. It may actually take away your focus. So it's all related to, you know, how much is safe. And I have some other things on there as well, like kids' toothpaste. Read the back of it. It says if the child ingests that whole tube of toothpaste, there's a potential poisoning on it. So that's something that, you know, you have to think about. Roundup, you know, most of us that watch TV have seen the class action lawsuits related to people that were exposed to Roundup. And again, if you're protecting yourself when you're using the product, shouldn't be a problem. But, you know, those things aren't always there. And I have a photo there of a chimney sweep. And the reason I put that in is this is kind of the first occupational exposure that was linked to illness. So they would have young kids go down through the chimneys and actually clean the chimneys out. And the young kids would look like this after doing several chimneys during the course of the day. Then the creosote that's in the chimney is actually a carcinogen. So this is one of the first connections. By the time these youngsters grew into adult age, most of them had skin cancer or other cancers from their exposure to the creosote. And the creosote is also part of the coal tar, coal tar, which is the residual product that accumulates in the chimney from burning coal and actually from wood as well. And that's why I have this scalp shampoo on here. Because nowadays, if you have dandruff or if you have a psoriasis type ailment, you're actually going to use a controlled dose of coal tar to treat that, to actually treat the bacteria that's on your scalp that's causing the dandruff. So again, it's dose. As long as the dose is appropriate, the risk is mitigated. So that's what I want to emphasize on that slide. So just to kind of go through again, dose is the amount of chemical or compound related to exposures. And if we think of the caffeine that I mentioned earlier, if you're doing moderate amounts, should be no problems. It's when you do excessive amounts that the problems begin. The toxicity is the actual lethal potential. The LD50 is what I have on there. It's the actual lethal potential to cause harm. um, some things are more toxic than other. You know, you think arsenic, say, compared to caffeine. You know, arsenic, very, very low concentrations could be lethal, where, you know, caffeine, very high concentrations would have a health effect, but not necessarily be lethal. The next part to consider is a pathway, the route of exposure. How does it get from where it exists, the contaminant where it exists, how does it get to those who actually would be exposed to it? Receptors are the endpoint of the exposure pathway. Receptors can be people, or it can be anything in the ecological environment. And if we want to find out information on that, there's a federal law that makes it so that every product has to have a safety data sheet. If you go buy paint at your local hardware store, when you're checking out, you can say, I need to have the safety data sheet. And by law, they're supposed to be able to give you that information, or at least connect you to the information. It all exists online nowadays. It used to be, you know, paper. And of course, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, which is a subset of the Center for Disease Control, they also produce information relative to various products, compounds, and chemicals, and you can get the toxicological profiles there as well. So let me explain a little bit about dose, toxicity, and pathway. So I'm going to use the original site conceptual model. So whenever you're investigating the site, one of the first things you have to do is start understanding the concept of the model of the site as it exists. So this cartoon here, the black and white one, I'm going to use this. This is the original one that EPA used. It actually came from ATSDR. But let's look at a scenario where there's a chemical spill here. And I typically tell people, think of this as something like gasoline. Most of us understand what gasoline is. We've pumped gasoline. We know it's a liquid. We know it can soak into the ground. We also know that it can evaporate into the air. So that if we have something like a gasoline spill here, some of it could soak into the ground, ultimately getting to groundwater. Some of it in the soil can actually vaporize or evaporate and move as a gas through the soil, and then some of it can evaporate up into the air. So that if somebody comes onto this area, they would have three potential exposure routes. They could ingest, inhale, or direct contact. So if this person walks up and smells the vapor as it's evaporating, there's an exposure route. If they reach over and touch it, again, exposure route. And if they were curious, now maybe an adult might not be curious, but a 6-year-old might actually put their hand in it, direct contact, and then put their hand in their mouth, which would be ingestion. So those would be your exposure pathways. Now, if we think about the system, here's this release, and it's moving through the soil vapor and the groundwater. Here's a house with a well, someone in the house. Again, three potential exposure pathways. They can inhale it because when they turn on the water, it could vaporize into the airspace. The gas going through the soils could actually come into the basement and permeate the house that way. Direct contact, showering, washing your hands, etc. So you can start seeing how these things actually end up being exposure points. Now, for contrast, this adult and child here probably aren't having exposures to this because they're not in the house and they're not close enough to be exposed here. So they only may have one pathway, which would be inhalation. That's part of the model. The next, let's look at the cow here. And let's assume that, if Bessie comes over and eats this corn, well, maybe this corn actually absorbs some of that. So there's another ecological receptor. Likewise, the trees, if these were fruit trees, maybe they take it as well. So that's what you have to do, is put together a site conceptual model and kind of understand the pathways and the potential exposure routes, because ultimately that's one of the things you want to try to break, is those exposure pathways. Next, you have to understand the chemical characteristics and how the characteristics of the contaminants actually affect their mobility. So are they solid, liquid, or gas? And going back to my gasoline example, it can be a liquid, but it can easily transfer into a gas, okay? This time of the year, we throw a lot of salt down on streets to try to keep the roads safer. And the salt's going down as a solid, but then when it warms up and rains, it gets turned into a solution, and that salt then runs off, and that goes off into the environment. The solubility also affects how well things move in the subsurface as well as the air. The density, some things preferentially migrate downward into groundwater columns, some of them stay floating. Some things absorb onto surfaces. And the last part is half-life. Some chemicals, again, I'll use the gasoline, have relatively short half-lives, something in the range of years to maybe decades, whereas things like PCBs may have centuries for half-lives, and that affects how long something will be in the environment as a potential exposure. The other issue to go through on this, and I don't want to go too much into the details here of the chemistry, because I want to get more to some of the examples so people have a sense of how you work with these things. But the light non-aqueous phase liquids, which are your motor fuels, those tend to be low solubility. You think oil and water don't mix. So when they leak from their storage containers, they can tend to accumulate in the upper portion of the water column. They will contaminate what's known as a soil chimney here. And if they're a dense non-aqueous phase, this would be your dry cleaning fluids, your solvents, your chlorinated compounds. They actually will move because they're heavier than water down through the water table. These are much more difficult to deal with than these LNAPLs or floaters, okay? The other aspect that I need to explain too is this partial solubility. Whenever gasoline comes into contact with a soil particle, it preferentially coats it. Think about when you fry bacon in a skillet. If you just use water, it's almost impossible to get the bacon grease out of the skillet. And that's because the grease preferentially wets the surface of the skillet and the water can't displace it. And you see Dawn often runs their commercials with a little duck that's gotten into an oil spill and they use the Dawn. Well, the detergent, which would be the Dawn, is actually changing the wetting surface and allowing the oil to be removed, okay? In a spill environment like the one on the top here showing in red, that gasoline would coat the soils, then every time the water would come in contact with that, when rainfall would percolate through the soil or the chemical would come into contact with the aquifer, it would slowly dissolve a little bit of that chemical, okay? Um, so if we look at the solubility of benzene, one of the compounds that's actually in gasoline, it's soluble at 1,750 milligrams per liter. That's a kind of a low number, but the maximum contaminant level, the level that is considered safe to drink, is 0.005. So you can see that it doesn't take a lot to be a persistent source of ongoing contamination. Okay, and that was the point I wanted to make with partial solubility. So how do we deal with this in Ohio? Ohio developed in 1980 or 1994, they developed the Voluntary Action Program. The federal EPA basically mandated every state come up with their own voluntary cleanup program. Ohio is one of the few states that actually uses certified professionals or CPs to do that. And if you look up the Ohio Administrative Code under 3745-300, you'll actually get to the rules that the voluntary brownfield cleanups are guided by. And going back to the CPs, and I am a CP, Ohio actually allows private citizens to be certified to supervise and administer the cleanups. And then in Ohio, the CP can basically issue a no further action, and they can also ask for concurrence from Ohio EPA. But in essence, Ohio EPA has delegated that down. It was a way for the state to allow professionals to supervise the cleanup without actually having more employees added to Ohio EPA. So that was the philosophy behind it. So when you evaluate a brownfield site, what all is involved? Well, the first part of it is what's known as a phase one. This is a records review and a site visit. So you're going to try to dig up, and again, as I said earlier, this is a little bit of detective work. You're going to try to dig up all the information you can about what happened at the site. You want to go back to its initial development, so you typically want to go back to whenever the property was not developed, either being a farm or just virgin land, and go through and see what happened at the site. And what commonly happened in the 1940s and 50s is whenever there were waste products, if a property had space, then they typically would just take it out back and bury it. And there was really no records kept. So trying to tease this out it can be kind of difficult at times. So if during the phase one record review, if there is potential for contamination to exist at a site, then that triggers a phase two investigation. And again, during the site visit, if you see, potential disposal areas, you see areas where there's no grass growing, and it looks like it's distressed vegetation, stained, etc., then those are the kind of things that you're going to, the CP would be looking at that and making note of it and basically saying, yeah, this is probably a site where we need to go to phase two. Phase two is the actual sampling, delineation, and assessing. So if you identified a potential area or an identified area, as they're referred to in the VAP program, the Voluntary Action Program, then what you need to do is determine what the potential contaminants are, again, kind of relating back to that dose and toxicity. Then you want to come up with your site conceptual model, and you want to start projecting the mobility of those contaminants, again, the fate and transport that I was discussing earlier. And then you want to start talking about exposure pathways. How could the contaminant get to either people or ecological receptors? And then the last part of that, you can either remove the contamination, which could be excavation, pump and treat, things like that, or you can eliminate the pathway using an engineering control, and I'll get into that a little more. And again, it's really important to envision what this site could actually become in the future. Is the contamination such that making it a housing development probably requires too much expense? Well, then are there alternate things that could happen? And even recreational use is one of the options as well, and I'll talk more about that as we go forward here. The photos in this site at Otterbein, we actually have a well field where Ohio EPA comes up and actually will use our well field to do their training. And what's nice is Ohio EPA also allows the students to participate in their training sessions. So the students actually get a fair amount of hands-on. You can see they're being shown how to do well sampling in that top photo. And then in the lower photo, Ohio EPA's drilling team is showing them how to construct monitoring wells at the site. So it's a real win-win for EPA, Ohio EPA, and Otterbein students. So getting back to assessment and remediation and engineering controls, some of the things you can do, as I said earlier, is just remove the contaminants. That middle photo, they're actually pulling hydrocarbons off the groundwater using a sorbent. That was work that was done up in the Cleveland area. You can restrict site activities. Let's assume that you can't get the water totally clean, which is most sites. So you limit by using a deed restriction use of groundwater in that particular area, or you just isolate the contamination. And I can get into more examples of that, but isolating the contamination often is covering it with a pavement or using some other way of covering it with clean soils, things like that. But you have to make sure that isolating it, it's not going to be mobile under the barrier that you're using to isolate it with. So let's take a look at some of the brownfield success stories. These are primarily Columbus examples here. One of the first ones that was done, there was an old manufacturing facility down along the Scioto River in downtown Columbus. And this is, if you're familiar with downtown Columbus, where 71 and 70 come together through the center of town, you'll see this building, and actually this angle is not quite as good. If I photograph from the other side, you'd see that noted curved roof on it. It has a kind of a semi-curved roof that's more apparent from another angle. But this is an apartment building that was built on contaminated soils. And because the soils weren't volatile, and they also put a parking garage at the lower one, the lower 2 levels on this, the parking garage prevents any potential vapors that could exist from coming up into the living area. So this is one of the ways that they understood the fate and transport, the exposure pathways, and how you break the exposure pathways. And this building is a result of that. If you look at, this is another on 670. This is the Smith Brothers hardware store. Now, this one was contaminated primarily with asbestos, but there were some disposal activities on site. This was a warehouse in the early 1900s. It was right next to the rail lines, and basically rail cars would come in and then they would break bulk on this and then distribute to the hardware stores in the central Ohio area. So This is one that if you go to EPA's webpage, they actually feature this one because it went through it was one of the early VAP program success stories. If you look immediately north with it, this is an older photo. This photo is probably from like 2010, 2012. This is the old Jeffrey mining site, which had a lot of challenges to it. And with the development in downtown Columbus, this is actually starting to fill in quite a bit now with building because they've done some remediation, but they've also looked at ways of designing the buildings to make sure that the risk doesn't transcend to those that are in the buildings. The Columbus Convention Center is built over top of what used to be a CSX rail yard. This is one of my first trips to Columbus before I moved here permanently. I was doing some work for CSX and they were going to sell this underutilized rail yard. Rail yards are kind of notorious for having a fair amount of contamination just from things dripping out of cars and engines dumping loads of fuel and things like that. So if you're down at the convention center, just think back back into the 1990s. It was actually a rail yard before that. Camden Yards, where the Orioles play in Baltimore, was another one of those projects we worked on. And now it's a baseball field. So this is one, the old Crew Stadium here. You can tell by these tilted light posts on that. This was the old Columbus Auto Parts, or the Columbus Auto Parts manufacturing facility. It sat vacant. This is right off of 71. And it sat vacant for a couple of decades because of the contamination. A developer went in, did a cleanup on this. There's residual contamination, and this is one where the engineering barrier or the engineering control is the parking lot. So a certified professional has to go out every year and certify that the parking lot is in good condition. And that parking lot, the pavement, is what actually prevents the customer from being exposed to the residual contaminants. So that's an example of a engineering control. The new Crew Stadium, which is now lowerfield.com, is also built on a former brownfield site. This was a former manufacturing area here. There was a lot of cleanup work done in the early 2000s. And then when they were looking for a spot to put the new stadium, this property was still available. And the design of the stadium basically supported the mitigation of risk using engineering controls. Again, pavement, ventilation of substructures, things like that were part of it. Likewise, this is where the Columbus Clippers play baseball. The baseball field was actually excavated about 14 feet down and clean fill was brought in on that site. I think that one was actually a former coal gasification site. So these are just a couple more examples of things that have been redeveloped on that. Immediately next to the baseball field is this Promo West. It's changed its names a few times. I'm not sure what the name is right now, but this is an outdoor, well, it's actually partial indoor and outdoor. They use it year round, but the outdoor seating there, you can see it's grass seating, but it's a concert venue in downtown Columbus. And of course, where the Blue Jackets play, Nationwide Arena, that whole area was brownfield because that was what little bit of industrial that there was in Center City. Columbus was in the general area of where the arena was. In fact, this is the old Moline plow where they made farm plows back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that was a brownfield site as well. So let me talk a little bit more about, those ones were all kind of developed inner city. Let's look at one that's green space, because one of the things that cities recognize, and if you talk to environmental scientists and you talk to planners, green space is essential for any living area. You need places to recreate, you need open areas, and this is kind of Columbus's gem, I would say. It's what they call it Whittier Peninsula, and actually this is the peninsula here, but this was, there's downtown Columbus. This was basically an industrial area and actually a most of it was landfill. Where I'm circling the cursor here, originally, and what you're seeing on there, this was the impound lot. So if you parked illegally in Columbus or at Ohio State, this lot was where you were going to go retrieve your car from. And beneath this lot, this was all trash. I mean, this was an old landfill, and we're going back into the 1920s, 1930s when this was an active disposal area, non-permitted, basically town dump type of operation. So I was involved in the early 2000s in some of the initial phase 2 work on this. In fact, we did the drilling in here to define that pretty much that whole footprint of the impound lot um, was all waste material on that. A couple of large warehouses here, a couple of small city buildings. If we look 1994 Google Earth image, this is what you see. Not exactly a pretty part of downtown. And of course, your downtown high rises and everything are just off of this image up here. So what was there? Well, at one point in time, there was a railroad repair yard. That was the late 1800s, the city dump, which I've already referenced. There was a concrete facility there. They made batch that would have gone out in trucks, and they also made some small precast type products. So that gives us an idea of what kind of waste would have been with that. A petroleum storage facility. These would have been above ground tanks mostly. These would have been they would have had deliveries, tractor and trailer type deliveries, and then smaller trucks going out to homes, like for home heating, fuel, and things like that. Warehousing. The old Lazarus, which is now part of Macy's, warehouse was the bigger building there that I was showing at. Of course, the impound lot, which was on top of the dump, and there were several other small manufacturing facilities. So if we look at kind of what was there, well, there's the impound lot. And this was the warehouse. Notice this water tower because it'll show up in the later photos there. But you can see the warehouse was in pretty bad shape. You can see daylight through the roof on here, drums and chemical storage containers. Different building here. You can see this was a manufacturing facility. Again, when they left in a hurry and left a lot of potentially contaminating materials behind. Again, this is a different angle of this particular warehouse. There were homeless camps. When the city decided that they were going to develop this site, they identified over 400 people who were basically using this as their primary residence. In fact, when I was working down there, I remember the shack in the photo. That gentleman actually had his mail delivered to there. He had an address on it. So there was a lot of illegal open dumping, a lot of vandalism, a lot of illegal sexual conduct, a lot of prostitution. Drug abuse and sales were occurring down there all the time. It really wasn't all that safe of a place. So if we go and look now, what we see there is the city over a decade basically come up with a vision, and they also used funding from the Clean Ohio Fund, which was valid through most of the 1990s into the early 2000s. Those monies got shifted during the Kasich administration for Jobs Ohio, so it was a different application. But they broke this down into, I believe it was 4 projects, and they proceeded to develop certain parts. There is an Otterbein Center here now, which is a LEEDs Gold building. There's exercise facilities here. There's a dog park. It's up here now. In this photo, it was actually down there. So it's a dog park, walking trails, water features, open space for soccer, climbing wall, and that water tower became a bird viewing platforms, okay? And the reason Audubon's name is on there is this is part of the North American Flyway. So in order to be able to redevelop this, the city put together Metro Parks, Audubon, Grange Insurance, and basically in that partnership, they were able to attract the funding necessary to build this space. And again, it's on the bike path. It connects to downtown. So this is part of the green space and the recreational for people that are living in downtown Columbus. And it's part of the Metro Park system now as well. So Metro Parks it maintains this and basically patrols it and does a very good job. So let's just take a look at what's there now. That water tower. So now there's 2 decks here where you can go up and actually do some bird watching on that. They have water features on it because this is in the floodplain. Even though there is a flood wall along it, most of the property is below the floodplain. So we have these water features. This is a fitness course. You can see the large tires back here. You can go over and flip the tires, crawl over the wood. These are tires together so that you run through them, kind of like you see football players and soccer players doing a lot. Outdoor sand volleyball, obstacle courses, picnic shelters. And again, there's Miranova with that curved roof that I was talking about before. And you can see how this is all just a walking distance from downtown. And the trails, okay? And this was a building that was there, and that was that one that had the drums inside that I showed the earlier photo. Now it's actually prairie growth on there, and that's intentional. I'll get to that in a second. And again, this is all landfill beneath this open space, but this space is often utilized year round for like soccer or people that just need space to go out and do stuff. Sometimes the metro parks will line it off for soccer fields and flag football fields as well. But there's the old photo that I had from 2024. There's the water tower, and there it is now repurposed as a bird watching sanctuary. Okay. And this was an area that was just kind of, there was a lot of dumping here because the old Whittier Street came down in dead end and people would back up into here and throw out their trash. And you can see what it looks like now. And again, this is prairie with water feature. And this was the old entrance to the impound lot. This is all trash underneath here, but you don't know that because it's maintained with a soil cover, and it's basically serving as a barrier. So now let me get back to the engineering controls that I talked about. And you'll notice this is signage from over at the park itself. These wetlands construction in conjunction with environmental remediation efforts, and the following covenants are in effect for both humans and pets. No contact, consumption, swimming, fishing, or wading in these wetlands is allowed. And that's why they don't mow it. That also encourages people, most people don't want to walk through what's essentially heavy brush. And so that's part of the engineering control for this particular area. This is the old building here, which is now used for parking. That concrete surface is there intentionally to protect visitors so that they're not exposed to the chemicals underneath. Likewise, this parking lot is the same. This is just a different angle of that same building floor, and then there's the climbing wall that's part of this area. There's the LEEDS Gold Certified Audubon Center with all the features on that, including the solar panels, the overhang to allow the shade in the summertime, but actually allow the low angle sunlight to get in the winter. This is looking from the north to the south of the same building, and it goes through this walkway goes through the wetlands feature. And if you go to Whittier, there's a lot of things you can do there. You can do bird watching, walking, wall climbing, exercise, the Bark Park, and just be outdoors. Likewise, where I work at Otterbein, we have our own version of a brownfield that is now part of our equine program. It's actually where the barns and the horses are kept. And from a historical perspective, it was a bomb manufacturing facility in the 1940s during World War II and into the early 1950s. And what you're looking at here is this is the actual Quonset huts where bombs were assembled. This is where the chemicals were actually formulated for the explosives. And some of these bombs, these were incendiary bombs, some of these bombs were actually used in Doolittle's raid. So there's a little bit of a historical connection there as well. So this was owned originally by the Kilgore Company. They went bankrupt in 1962, but right before they filed bankruptcy, they actually gifted this property, 100 and roughly 120 acres, gifted it to Otterbein, and Otterbein ran most of the facility, what I'm going around with the cursor now, through the Brownfield program, and then developed their equine facility. And you can see the horse stalls here, the indoor riding, the outdoor riding. This portion is currently undergoing additional remediation. This is going to be developed similar to what was done at Whittier Peninsula that I just showed you. It's going to be an outdoor walking trails, and a portion of it is likely to become a solar field too. One of the long-term goals is to hopefully take this off grid with solar energy on the redeveloped. And again, that engineering plans or the engineering controls will be used as part of the design criteria. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll see if we have the ability to do some questions here and see if there's anything that I can answer. I appreciate your attention.
Dr. Svitana, thank you. I really did enjoy that presentation. I was pretty fascinated about learning the different exposure pathways that these contaminants can actually end up into the bodies of people, animals, and plants alike. I was trying to keep up with the lingo, the chemistry lingo about solubility and density and absorbance and whatnot. But yeah, the devil's really in the details here. Um, well, to the attendees, there is a chat and question chat box on your screen, and if you would like, you can drop questions there. But Dr. Svitana, I do have a question for you, if you'd be so
Sure.
kind to answer. I was curious, what regulatory agencies in particular set and enforce restrictions on land use for these brownfield sites?
So that would fall under the purview of Ohio EPA.
Yeah.
The process is you basically propose what the restrictions are going to be. The agency then reviews them. You know, there is a dialogue between the agency and the owners of the property. And
Hmm.
then once there is an agreement, then the deed restrictions are actually entered onto the deed in perpetuity. And that's actually done at the county courthouse, so that if you go to a deed restricted property, if you're interested in buying it, when you do your title search and look at your deed, you're actually going to see that EPA has a document affixed to the deed, or it's actually part of the deed, because the deed is actually amended to adopt the wording on there that says what those restrictions are going to be.
I see. Um, so when you say that there are like restrictions on the deed, does Ohio EPA implement those in the first place? Like, do they have the authority to put a restriction on deeds? Like, how does
Yes.
that process work? Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. EPA has the authority through the Voluntary Action Program and
Yeah.
actually some of the other statutes in the ORC as well as the OAC
Hmm.
to limit activities on properties
Hmm.
um, to protect the public.
Sure, sure. I see.
And
Um,
and if there is a deed restriction
yeah.
and a new let's say a new owner comes along and wants to address the restriction, you know, what causes,
Hmm.
let's say they come and do additional cleanup work. If
Hmm.
they do that, then the restriction could be lifted in the future. But until somebody does that, and again, that would require revisiting with Ohio EPA and having the
Hmm.
deed restriction lifted. So,
Hmm.
but it's a
I see.
pretty involved process.
Yeah, yeah. It looks that way. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. I wonder if like there's like a hodgepodge of rules throughout the US. Like, does it differ that much state by state? I don't know if you know, but I'm just
There,
like wondering.
I work in quite a few states, and they're all similar, but they all have their own nuance. Uh, Federal EPA has kind of like a minimum that each state had to adopt, and then most states adopted their brownfield programs um, to basically meet what is appropriate for that state. So, you know, there are some other states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, use a similar CP type setup where individuals are certified by the state to supervise the work. Then you have like Pennsylvania where it's an Act 2, you know, any professional can do the work. However, in Pennsylvania, the DEP is involved in all the steps.
Hmm.
Whereas in Ohio, an
Hmm.
owner of a property can contact a CP, do the cleanup work, and never engage with Ohio EPA
Yep,
unless they want concurrence from Ohio EPA.
I see. So the essence of the rules are pretty much the same across the board,
Yes,
but you know there may be a
correct.
little more enforcement here and there. I see. That's it's interesting to know. I was also wondering, so in the context of public parks, you spent a good amount of time talking about the Whittier Peninsula case in
Mhm.
Columbus, and that got me wondering, how do regulations governing the tolerance levels of contaminants at public parks differ compared to other types of land use at these sites? Like, understandably, residential residential development, they would have higher standards of removing and containing contaminants as opposed to, like, I don't know, industry or something. I was just
Yeah,
wondering what your thoughts were.
the risk models are based on the intended use.
Yeah.
So the most restrictive is going to be residential because you assume
Hmm.
number one, children are the what you have to protect the most. So you're
Hmm.
assuming children are on site 24/7
Hmm.
for a residential. At a park scenario, you would look at what the potential, you know, how often is somebody going to a park? How much time are they going to spend there? How much dose are they actually going to get of a residual contaminant? That all goes into a formulation that comes up with standards then for what the cleanup levels have to be.
Hmm.
And again, you would use some of those engineering controls to help protect the public, like putting parking lots in areas where you don't want people directly touching,
Hmm.
or doing the prairie settings where the vegetation is going to be such that most people aren't going to go in there and be doing things where they're going to be exposing themselves.
Sure.
So that's really the models look at who's going to be the user, what are the chemicals that you're trying to protect from, what are
Yep.
the exposure scenarios, and then how do you evolve that into a model that then you can actually predict a risk.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. Yeah, it seems like that the response in essence is governed in
Hmm.
what are the exposure pathways, how often might exposure take place, and who's being exposed. So yeah,
Correct.
yeah, that makes sense. We are getting some questions in the chat. I'll read off the first one
Okay.
if
I'm going to say
that's
I'm
okay
not really seeing the
with Svitana.
chat. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's a clunky system, but yeah. Anyways, somebody asks, does the EPA take into consideration the length of time a toxins remain in the system into approved exposure amounts?
Yes, that's part of the overall risk. I mean, there are toxicologists that is their full-time job is
Yep.
looking at what exposure amounts and then how well it or how it may bioaccumulate,
Hmm.
those type of things. So yeah, that is actually part of the formulation.
I see. That's yeah, I mean that makes sense to me for sure. Yeah, I wonder if like what am I saying? I wonder if the EPA at all like puts into place any plans of how land use at a site could change over time depending on the say the half-life of a contaminant. I'm not, you know, I'm not a chemistry major, so I'm not too familiar with all the different kinds of contaminants, but like, what if there was, for instance, a sort of contaminant that's like, I don't know, like 10 times less dangerous in 50 years or some sort? Like, could the EPA like amend the deed restriction to say this land could be used for more uses, or like um, less vigilance could be taken in 30 years if it were being developed? Like, do you know if that
Yeah,
long-term planning takes
the,
place?
the process would require you to go back and do a demonstration that
Yeah,
the
makes sense.
original assumptions are no longer in play.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
until you demonstrate that, then the original restrictions would stay, would remain. But
Hmm.
it would be possible, particularly something like, well, I'll just use gasoline as an example because it's not as persistent.
Yeah.
If that was your driver for your risk, you could probably revisit in 30 years. And between natural breakdown of the gasoline
Yeah.
and attenuation, you could probably
Hmm.
revisit that site and eliminate or reduce the restrictions. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think that, yeah, that also like, yeah, I mean, it sounds like, at least when it comes to what the rules are trying to do, that sounds like it totally makes sense, because like these agencies, they have a responsibility to protect the public and protect the people that go into these sites. So even if like a landowner is like, oh yeah, no, the site's totally fine, like it's been 30 years since you guys checked it, but if they want to update the deed, then they're gonna have to prove that the site
Right.
is safe for
Right.
whatever they want to reuse it for. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so somebody asks, what is the chain of contact for how a potential property owner would be directed to a CP like yourself?
Actually, if you just Google Ohio certified professionals, you'll go to Ohio EPA's webpage and you'll
Hmm.
see a listing, and there's roughly 100, little over 100 individuals who are certified
Yeah.
by Ohio EPA.
Okay.
And if you contact EPA, I mean that's in essence what they would tell you is the list
Hmm.
is published and you would go
Hmm.
on the list to find one. Yeah.
I see. Well, that's certainly that's good to know. Um, ooh, this is a good question. What are the requirements for public notification of contaminants, for any property up for sale on like the land market?
It's well, it's buyer beware.
Oh yeah.
Um, there from a legal standpoint,
Hmm.
if you're borrowing money, the lending institution is going to drive that. They're basically going to require the due diligence because they're going to be trying to protect themselves from the
Hmm.
liability on it.
Hmm.
Um, if you are a seller and someone asks the questions, you are expected to fully respond. And if it's a site where the work has been done and the knowledge is there, then you can't, you can't not disclose on it. So,
Sure.
um, are there specific laws that spell that out? Off the top of my head, I don't know them,
Yeah.
but I just
Sure.
know that through the due diligence process for any property, there is some level of environmental questions asked.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I get what you mean. Yeah. Yeah, like I do know that there are a lot of sites in Cuyahoga County and Lake County that are brownfield sites,
Hmm.
and that are being looked at for possible redevelopment. We have what's called the Flats,
Yeah.
near the mouth of the Cuyahoga River, and
Hmm.
there's a lot of redevelopment going on down there.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm just like wondering, like, the historical owners of those properties, like, what if they themselves don't even know like what is going on at that site?
And
Like,
sometimes, yeah, and sometimes that happens too. And
yeah.
again, the law is pretty clear that
Mhm.
if you can demonstrate you've done your due diligence
Yeah.
and you didn't discover anything,
Yeah.
then you can claim innocent landowner. But
Mm,
if you just buy the property and don't do any of the due diligence,
yeah.
US EPA and Ohio EPA are basically going to say you bought it, it's yours.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, so like it really is like when it comes to a potential land buyer, it's in their interest
Mhm.
to do that due diligence, and I'm sure like with like the land market itself, like those trying to sell, they probably want to, I don't know. I mean, like just be open, be straightforward
Yeah.
with like what they have in their property, because it sounds like it might come back and bite them later if they don't.
Yeah, if you don't disclose, then it's open to you. You could be sued. You definitely could be sued.
Oh well, damn. Okay. Companies just. So I was wondering. So are you at all aware of what um government agencies do in response to companies failing, like going out of business and leaving behind a bunch of like contaminated land assets? Like what happens
Actually,
with that?
Ohio is kind of unique. They
Yeah.
have rules called the Cessation of Regulated Operations, or CRO. Any industry, any business that has hazardous materials, and that
Mhm.
could be anything from cleaning materials to
Mhm.
toxic chemicals. If you have those, then you're required, and there's a time frame, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but it's like
Yeah.
90 days, 60 days type of thing. You're
Yeah.
required to give Ohio EPA notification on that, and then Ohio EPA does an inspection of the facility to
Mhm.
basically certify that you've cleaned house
Mhm.
before you're done. There were several businesses in the 1990s that
Yeah.
basically closed their doors, walked away, and left things behind. The buildings got
Yeah.
vandalized, and then there
Yeah.
were releases as a relation as a part of that.
Yeah.
And that's why Ohio EPA actually they developed rules, and there's actually a section in the OAC that basically
Mhm.
says what owners have to do if they're closing a facility, and it's pretty
Mm.
involved. I've done a
Yeah.
couple of them, and yeah.
Hmm. I see. Yeah, I mean, like the first thing that comes to mind, at least like from a social point of view, is that exposure to brownfields, it's an environmental justice issue,
Hmm.
especially when like companies pack up all their stuff, they leave, and they do some technical like jump through hoops just to leave behind a contaminated site that poisons nearby communities. Like I know that like that has happened
Right,
over like throughout history. So I was just wondering, like, what sort of regulatory responses might there be? But that's good to hear that Ohio EPA does enforce those sort of rules.
right,
And I guess it's no surprise that it came around in like the 90s and stuff.
right.
Yeah, I do wonder if I do wonder if like this new round of industrialization taking place across the U.S., like reshoring, friendshoring, bringing back industry. I wonder if like they're looking at some of the same places, same plots of land that were used in previous rounds of industrialization. And I don't know.
There are, and again, there
Yeah,
are reasons, there are incentives to do that. Like a
yeah,
brownfield site,
yeah.
there are tax abatements. Essentially,
Really?
you pay, yeah. The way the Ohio voluntary action program works
Hmm.
is essentially you get a 10-year tax break. So they
Hmm.
value the property at what it is at diminished value. Then if you do the cleanup and redevelop the site, you're
Yeah.
paying taxes on that diminished value for 10 years forward before that would go away. So that's really kind of the incentive to get people to get back into brownfield sites and
Mm-hmm.
redevelop them. Um,
Hmm.
One of the big challenges, though, is there's always a fairly sizable cost at a pretty
Yeah.
contaminated site. And
Yeah.
if you go to a farm field, you don't have to do that cost.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, we're experiencing it right now in the Columbus area. Intel's basically building that facility on
Oh
farm fields when
yeah.
have to question there are enough there are enough brownfield sites around.
No.
Could that have been done on a brownfield site? So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, these topics of like land use change and like proper land. like proper land preservation and like contaminants. It's all intertwined. And like that kind of like leads me to like my next question about zoning. I was wondering, um, like what do you know about like the relationship between municipalities changing zoning codes around surrounding brownfield sites and how those sites like change over time? Like this with this Whittier Peninsula um, example with a public park, well, a public park forming out of a contaminated brownfield site. Do municipalities like see that
That,
contamination abatement and be
yeah.
like, hey, maybe people can live around here now? Like, does that happen?
Yes, that does happen. And again, that's part of your early planning. And, in some of the slides I
Yeah,
had, you have that vision of what it can be.
yeah,
The planners really then need to approach the local municipality and say,
hmm,
here's what we would like to do. And if we can achieve certain milestones, we'd like to
yeah,
rezone or we would like to restructure. Um,
hmm,
and a lot of times too, you're going to go to the city and say, hey, we're going to need different access
hmm,
because of the type of development we want to do. And those type
hmm,
of things just have to be worked out on the front end.
hmm.
So
I
that's
see.
why, I'll go back and re-emphasize again, you
Yeah,
really have to have a vision of what you want it to be
yeah,
so that you can understand the regulatory requirements, but there's also all of that planning and development
hmm,
issues that go with it as well.
hmm. I see. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Just having a clear cut vision of what you want the whole site to be. I mean, yeah, I mean, like positive change that's brought on the brownfield sites, it's not contained just to that site. Like
Hmm.
I'm just like thinking about like community revitalization and
Hmm.
like in the and just I know I keep saying the flats, but like that's the best example that I can think of around here. Right next to this Irish Town Bend development taking place in the flats,
Hmm.
there's this like 40, 50, I don't know how big. It's a huge plot of land right next to the Cuyahoga River. The
Hmm.
skyline of Cleveland's right there, and it was a former railroad like station, I think, and the whole place was just has just been leveled in the past couple of years. And I hear there's plans for high rises, there's plans for like really dense shopping malls and residential places and stuff. And I'm just like, I've been like thinking like, what's in that soil? Like, what sort of regulatory response has there been to set up like a plan to figure out what to do with
Yeah.
that site? So yeah, that's
Yeah, and I'm sure that there have been conversations and
yeah,
that has been looked at. I mean, the city is
yeah,
is
sure.
well aware of these type of things.
Hmm,
So
hmm,
they've probably, and in fact, a lot of times taking care of the environmental issues will delay the projects by quite a bit
yeah,
because
sure.
it takes a while to do the cleanup work. Just like
Yeah, yeah.
the new soccer stadium here in Columbus. I mean, they started that cleanup years ago, and
Hmm,
because nobody was really interested in that parcel, it kind of went quiet for
I
probably
see.
about 5, 7 years. And then when they started talking about a new soccer stadium and where can you build it, and it's next to the
Yeah,
baseball stadium, then the interest came back again, and progress went ahead on it. So.
I see. Yeah, I guess it really just depends on like whether the political winds are there at the same time.
Hmm.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
see. Um, Well, Dr. Svitana, I don't see any more questions. So
Okay.
if you're ready to wrap up, then I am as well.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you for the
Okay.
opportunity, and I appreciate
All
folks
right.
who listened in.
Yeah, Dr. Svitana, I had a great time talking with you. I thought we had an excellent discussion on how like these regulatory regimes they interact with industry and community to clean up these sites and make them into places that we can all use and enjoy. So thank you for joining once again, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Bye
All
bye.
right, and to all the attendees, thank you for participating in our discussion today, and wish you all a lovely day. In my follow-up email, I will include a link to this recording, and yeah, all right, have a nice day, everyone. Thank you.
Take care. Bye
All
bye.
right, you as well.